I stood there, in the middle of a lavish wedding, but not to celebrate, to destroy. As my father raised his glass to toast his new marriage, he had no idea that the secrets he had buried for nearly 3 decades were about to come crashing down. And I was the one who would tear them open. The champagne glass trembled in my hand as I watched my father kiss his new bride. Hundreds of guests erupted in applause, their voices blending into a symphony of celebration. But I heard only one voice, my mother's, weak but resolute in her final days. "Deborah, promise me, you'll uncover the truth." I had promised. And tonight, beneath the glittering chandeliers and the hollow smiles, I was going to keep that promise. Across the table, my father's piercing gaze locked onto mine, a silent warning. But it was too late. In my clutch, my mother's letter burned like a loaded gun, ready to fire. They thought this was a wedding. For me, it was the beginning of his downfall. I took a slow breath, steadying the storm raging inside me. My father's gaze drilled into mine, daring me to back down. But he had underestimated me, just like he had underestimated my mother. He thought I would stay silent, that I would let him rewrite history without consequence. He was wrong. I wasn't just here to honor my mother's dying wish. I was here to finish what she started. She had spent years uncovering the truth, collecting evidence, waiting for the right moment. And now, I held it in my hands, the final piece that would dismantle the empire of lies he had built. The weight of my mother's letter pressed against my palm, a reminder that this wasn't just about me. It was about justice. About truth. About every whispered conversation behind closed doors, every deal made in the shadows, and every life he had manipulated to protect his perfect image. I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and met his stare without flinching. "You're making a scene," he hissed through clenched teeth, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I let a slow, knowing smile creep onto my lips. "No, Dad," I whispered back. "This is just the beginning." Before I share what happened next, the moment that left the entire room in stunned silence, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight for something you believed in, hit that like button, because trust me, this story is far from over. A tense silence settled over the room, the kind that crackled with unspoken truths and buried resentment. My father, always the master of control, was struggling to maintain his carefully crafted image. The distinguished businessman. The devoted family man. The generous philanthropist. But I had seen the cracks in that facade long before tonight. And now, so would everyone else. His new wife, Rosalind, shifted uncomfortably beside him, her manicured fingers tightening around his arm. She hadn't signed up for this confrontation, this unraveling of a legacy built on deception. The guests, once engrossed in their glasses of champagne and hushed conversations, were now frozen in place, their eyes flicking between us like spectators at a duel. "You don't have to do this, Deborah," my father said, his voice carrying that familiar mix of authority and quiet warning. The voice he had used all my life to keep me in line. The voice that once held power over me. But not anymore. I placed my hands on the table, fingers splayed against the crisp white linen, steadying myself. "Actually, I do," I replied, my voice even but firm. "Because she asked me to." For a fleeting moment, I saw it, the way his expression faltered, the way his fingers curled just slightly into fists at the mention of her. My mother. The one person who had ever stood up to him and refused to be erased. The woman whose final words now echoed through this room, carried by me. Rosalind's lips parted as if to speak, but before she could, my father pushed back his chair and stood. The movement alone commanded attention. Even the waitstaff halted mid-step. "Enough," he said, voice clipped. "This is neither the time nor the place for whatever spectacle you're trying to create." A cold laugh escaped me. "Oh, but it is, Dad. You made sure of that when you decided to start over like she never existed. When you thought you could bury the past without consequence." I reached for my clutch, my fingers grazing the edge of my mother's letter, the weight of it grounding me. But the past has a way of catching up with you. His jaw clenched, his composure hanging by a thread. You are making a fool of yourself. No, I said, standing to meet him eye to eye. I'm making things right. The room held its breath. Rosalind's hand slowly slipped from his arm. A few guests exchanged wary glances. And then, just beyond the crowd, I caught movement, and, watching intently from across the ballroom, the same calculating expression on her face that she had given me earlier. I wasn't alone in this. A charged silence hung in the air, thick with the weight of something unspoken, something trembling on the edge of revelation. My father's expression had darkened, his carefully constructed mask beginning to crack. He was losing control. And he knew it. I reached into my clutch, fingers closing around the letter that had haunted me for 2 years. My mother's last words. The truth she had fought to uncover. I had promised to make things right, and I intended to keep that promise. But before I could pull it out, someone spoke. Deborah. The voice was soft but firm. Familiar. I turned to see Yenia, my mother's closest friend, standing just beyond the edge of the crowd. Her dark eyes locked onto mine, then flicked briefly to my father. A silent warning. A reminder that I wasn't the only one who knew the truth. My father stiffened. You have no business here, he said coldly. Yenia didn't even blink. Oh, but I do. Natasha made sure of that. His name for her. The name he had tried to forget. The reaction was instant. His face paled just slightly, his fingers flexing at his sides. Rosalind's brow furrowed as she glanced between them, confusion giving way to something deeper. Suspicion. I exhaled slowly, then finally, deliberately, placed my mother's letter on the table. The envelope, yellowed with time, bore only my name in her handwriting. But inside was everything. You wanted to know why I came here tonight? I said, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. Why I couldn't just sit back and play the role of the obedient daughter. Because she knew, Dad. Mom knew everything. The room rippled with uneasy murmurs. My father let out a slow breath, shaking his head as if he could dismiss this as nothing more than theatrics. That letter means nothing. Really? I slid the envelope across the table toward him. Then open it. He hesitated. A single beat of silence. Then, from the far side of the room, Anne's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Maybe I should. Every head turned. Anne stepped forward, her presence commanding, her expression unreadable. She wasn't just a guest at this wedding. She was something else entirely. My father's lips pressed into a thin line. You stay out of this. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That's going to be a little difficult, considering I know exactly what's in that letter. The shift in the room was palpable. Rosalind sat up straighter. Kenneth, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What is she talking about? And took another step closer, eyes locked onto my father. Would you like to tell them? Or should I? For the first time that night, genuine panic flickered across his face. It was brief, but I caught it. So did Rosalind. So did every guest watching. And in that moment, I knew, this was bigger than I had ever imagined. The weight of the moment pressed down on the room, thick and suffocating. My father had spent years crafting a legacy, a pristine image built on power, wealth, and control. But cracks had formed, and tonight, I was here to shatter it completely. And held my father's gaze, unflinching. She wasn't bluffing. Whatever she knew, it was enough to make him sweat. Rosalind's fingers curled around her napkin, her knuckles turning white. Kenneth, she said again, this time sharper, more demanding. Tell me she's lying. My father exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, like a man trying to smother a fire that was already too far gone. This isn't the time or place for. No, I cut in, my voice ringing clear through the ballroom. It's exactly the time and place. Then, without breaking eye contact, I lifted my mother's letter and tore the seal. The sound echoed in the silence, as if the walls themselves held their breath. My hands were steady as I unfolded the pages. "Mom wanted me to wait," I said, scanning the first few lines, feeling the full force of her words wrap around me. "She told me not to open this until you remarried." I didn't understand why at first. But now? Now it all makes sense. My father's jaw tightened. "Deborah, don't." But I already had. I lifted my chin and read aloud. "My dearest Deborah, if you are reading this, your father has moved on, just as I knew he would. But before he closes the door on the past, there is something you need to know. Something I tried to tell you so many times but couldn't. The truth about Kenneth Bowen, about the life he's built, and the lies that hold it together." The murmurs grew louder. Rosalind's breathing quickened. I could feel the weight of every set of eyes in the room locked onto me. I turned the page. "Your father was never the man he pretended to be. He made his fortune not through brilliance, but through deception. It started with the company accounts, numbers that never quite added up, deals made in whispers. I found the proof, Deborah. I have everything." I reached into my clutch and pulled out a second envelope. "And she was right," I said, holding it up. "This isn't just a letter. It's evidence." My father's face darkened. He took a step forward, but I didn't back down. "Bank records," I continued. "Shell corporations. Offshore accounts. Bribes. Embezzlement. Even payments to a woman named Maria." I let that last name linger, watching as the color drained from his face. "You remember Maria, don't you, Dad?" Rosalind gasped. "Who is Maria?" Silence. And folded her arms. "Do you want to tell her, Kenneth? Or should I?" I didn't give him a chance to answer. "Maria was the woman before Mom," I said. "The one he paid to disappear. And I think we all know why." A sharp inhale from Rosalind. The sound of glass being set down a little too hard. The clinking of silverware as people shifted in their seats, leaning in. The room was unraveling, the weight of my words pressing down on my father's carefully constructed world. "Enough," my father finally snapped, his voice lower now, more dangerous. "You don't understand what you're doing." "Oh, I do," I shot back. "I understand perfectly. You thought you could erase the past. You thought you could control everything, just like you always have. But you made one mistake, Dad." His nostrils flared. "And what's that?" I smiled, slow and deliberate. "You underestimated me." The doors to the ballroom swung open. 2 men in dark suits stepped inside. Not guests. Not security. Federal agents. A collective gasp rippled through the room. My father's eyes flicked toward them, his face tightening. "This is a private event," he started, his voice carefully measured. One of the agents stepped forward, reaching into his coat pocket. "Kenneth Bowen," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice." The ballroom exploded into chaos. Gasps. Murmurs. Someone dropped a glass, the sharp crack of it splintering against the floor. Rosalind stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble. "Kenneth?" Her voice shook, but her expression had hardened. "Tell me this isn't true." My father didn't answer. He couldn't. One of the agents stepped toward him. "Please place your hands where we can see them." For a moment, I thought he might resist. His fingers twitched at his sides, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. But then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he raised his hands. I watched as they cuffed him. Watched as the room that had once admired him now whispered in shock and disgust. Watched as the legacy he had spent a lifetime protecting crumbled to dust in front of him. He turned his head, locking eyes with me one last time. "You think you've won," he said, his voice low and sharp. I tilted my head, considering him for a moment. Then I simply said, "No. Mom won." And with that, they led him away. The world my father built collapsed that night, but mine was just beginning. The headlines came first. Prominent businessman arrested in financial scandal. Kenneth Bowen's empire of lies exposed by his own daughter. His name, once synonymous with power and prestige, became a cautionary tale. Investors pulled out. The board scrambled. The empire he spent decades constructing turned to rubble in a matter of days. Rosalind filed for an annulment within a week. By then, I had already met with the authorities, handed over every document, every piece of evidence my mother had left behind. It was more than enough to ensure he would never talk his way out of this one. But that wasn't the victory. The real victory came later, in the quiet moments. The first time I met Maria. The woman my father had erased, the woman my mother had tried to protect. She was older now, tired, but when she saw me, something flickered in her eyes, recognition. A painful kind of love for the daughter she never got to raise. The first time I stood beside Sabrina, my twin sister, our reflections mirroring each other in ways I never knew I needed. We weren't just bonded by blood, but by everything we had survived. Everything we had lost. Everything we were about to rebuild. The first time I walked into what was once my father's office, now mine. The board, desperate to salvage what remained of the company, offered me a seat. But I had no interest in salvaging corruption. Instead, Sabrina and I dismantled it from the inside out. Every unethical deal was exposed. Every stolen dollar was tracked. And from the ashes, we built something new. Something real. We renamed it Phoenix Trust, a company dedicated to transparency, to justice, to ensuring no one else could be silenced the way my mother had been. The way Maria had been. Months later, on a crisp autumn morning, I stood in front of my mother's grave, the wind pulling at my coat. I ran my fingers over the etched letters of her name, tracing them the way I used to trace the lines of her face when I was a child. "We did it, Mom," I whispered. "I kept my promise." I could almost hear her voice in the wind. Soft. Proud. I wasn't just my father's daughter anymore. I was my mother's legacy. This story is more than just a tale of revenge, it's about truth, justice, and the power of resilience. It's about breaking free from the shadows of deception and reclaiming what was stolen. At its heart, it's a testament to the strength of those who refuse to stay silent, who fight for what's right no matter the cost. But now, I want to hear from you. Did this story resonate with you? If you enjoyed it, comment 2 below. If it wasn't your cup of tea, comment 7. And if you believe in standing up for the truth, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories, because sometimes, the most shocking truths are the ones that refuse to stay buried.